color and the line, Picasso, Matisse, and the rivalry that redefined art. Pablo Ruiz Picasso entered the world on October 25, 1881, in Malaga, a city on the southern coast of Spain that offered warm breezes and the faint, salt-tinged air of the Mediterranean Sea. His father, Don José Ruiz y Blasco, was a painter and art teacher whose gentle but unwavering discipline planted the seeds of artistic drive in the young boy from an early age. It is said that Picasso's mother, Maria Picasso y López, would gently tousle his hair and speak with pride about his fierce concentration whenever he put pencil to paper. Yet no one in the family could have foreseen how dramatically his vision would shape the course of modern art. Years before Picasso would stun the world with new ways of seeing, Henri-Émile Benoit Matisse was born on December 31, 1869, in the quiet town of Le Château-Cambrésis in northern France. The cold northern climate and the city's modest size did not immediately suggest a flamboyant artistic revolution. Matisse was not born into a lineage of artists. His father was a grain merchant, and his mother helped run a household goods shop. If there was artistry in the family, one might locate it in his mother's taste for vivid textiles or her delight in color. She arranged fabrics in the store in such a way that they seemed to sparkle in the otherwise drab environment. While Matisse was too young to articulate it, he was absorbing that spark. He once said in later years, "From the moment I held the box of colors in my hand, I knew this was my life," capturing a realization that took him from bleak beginnings to the forefront of 20th century art. Both Picasso and Matisse would become titans, but their paths to that eminence could not have been more different. Picasso's father, a teacher, recognized the boy's aptitude immediately. The story often retold, sometimes drifting into the realm of myth, was that Pablo's first word was pits, short for lapis, meaning pencil in Spanish. Whether literal or embroidered by proud relatives, the tale echoes the reality that the young Picasso showed an uncanny ability to render what he saw with unusual accuracy. He began drawing doves, bullfights, and the features of family members, capturing the shapes of the world around him with fervor. For a time, Don José tried to instruct him according to classical canons. He set up still life scenes, a bowl of fruit, a few eggs, the skull of a small animal, and the boy would carefully replicate them. Some nights, Picasso's father would come to the boy's room and correct the child's sketches, adjusting lines here and there. Soon, he found fewer and fewer mistakes to correct. By the time Picasso turned 14, it was the father who admitted to being surpassed. Legend holds that Don José handed over all his brushes, telling Pablo he would never paint again. Matisse, by contrast, was encouraged to follow a more bourgeois path. He studied law in Paris. He was diligent and methodical, if not particularly inspired by legal tomes. That he would one day become a pioneer of color and form was still a secret to himself. The crucial turning point came when he was around 20 years old. An attack of appendicitis struck him down, and during the long convalescence, his mother presented him with a box of paints. As Matisse recovered in bed, he took up the brush more as a pastime than as a calling. But soon, in the mixing of colors and the feel of bristles on canvas, he discovered a sense of liberation. It was like being struck by lightning, he would later tell a friend. The transformation was so profound that once he was well again, he abandoned his tentative plans for a legal career and insisted on studying art. His father, outraged, refused support at first. Yet Matisse, typically mild-mannered in other aspects of his life, was stubbornly steadfast in this new ambition. If Picasso had been raised under the gentle but knowledgeable guidance of an art teacher father, Matisse was forging his own path in defiance of paternal expectations. Picasso, at only 14, followed his family as they moved north to La Coruña in the Galician region of Spain, where Don José had found a new teaching position. The boy's later recollections of that time were steeped in a sense of grey skies and damp atmosphere, so different from sun-drenched Malaga. Yet it was a crucial developmental period. He gained admission to the School of Fine Arts there, where he systematically outshone peers, often several years older. But Picasso did not remain a star pupil for long. Around age 16, he was accepted into Barcelona's prestigious La Lonja, the School of Fine Arts, and rapidly made a name for himself among an avant-garde group of intellectuals who gathered at the café El Quatre Gats. The city's cultural life was vibrant. Modernist architecture, especially the organic forms championed by Antoni Gaudí, mirrored the sense of possibility budding across Europe. It was in Barcelona that Picasso found bohemian company, practicing quick sketches of café patrons, waiters, prostitutes, and the swirl of Catalan nightlife. He proved restless, often painting as though possessed, covering canvas after canvas with bold strokes, sometimes finishing multiple works in a day. This feverish approach characterized him for life. "I paint the way some people write their autobiography," he would say decades later. "The paintings, finished or not, are the pages." In Paris, some years before Picasso arrived, Matisse was immersing himself in formal instruction at the Académie Julian and then the École des Beaux-Arts under the tutelage of Gustave Moreau. He was older than the fledgling Picasso by more than a decade, but in a sense, he was also something of a late bloomer in the art world, having come to serious painting in his 20s. Though he worked diligently, he did not exhibit the flamboyant precocity that Picasso displayed. Instead, Matisse meticulously studied classical techniques, perhaps too meticulously. He felt a paradoxical desire to break free from the rules that he was so carefully learning. The famed teacher, Gustave Moreau, recognized something unique in Matisse's use of color. Where others might try to replicate nature's palette with subdued realism, Matisse's brush strove toward an intensity that hinted at what would become his signature approach: color as an emotional, not purely descriptive tool. Moreau once told him, "You were born to simplify painting," a statement that would resonate in Matisse's mind for years. But in those earlier days, he worried whether the older generation of critics and curators would ever accept the boldness he felt stirring inside him. For both men, Paris was the inevitable magnet. At the dawn of the 20th century, the city was abuzz with post-impressionist influences, the echoes of Van Gogh and Gauguin, the swirling color experiments of Georges Seurat, the symbolist moods of Puvis de Chavannes, and the radical leaps of Cézanne. Picasso made his first significant trip to Paris in 1900, the year of the Exposition Universelle, when the city was lit up with technological wonders and a sense of futuristic optimism. He was only 19, but he was determined to conquer the art scene. After a short trip back to Spain, he settled more permanently in Paris in 1904, moving into the famed Bateau Lavoir building in Montmartre. This rickety structure, nicknamed because it resembled a laundry boat on the Seine, became a hub for artists, writers, and hangers-on. Picasso's room was cramped and cold, often with scant money for food, but the place was alive with conversation and creative exchange. He frequented literary salons, rubbed shoulders with Gertrude Stein, and soaked up the influences of Toulouse-Lautrec and the city's nightlife. He began painting works suffused with melancholy, tinted with a dominant blue color scheme. Among them was La Vie, 1903, portraying two figures locked in a somber, almost sculptural embrace. This period, now known as the Blue Period, reflected Picasso's empathy for society's outcasts, beggars, prostitutes, the poor. "Blue is the color of all my dreams," he supposedly said at one point during this time, though the accuracy of that exact phrasing is debated. Nevertheless, the sentiment was there. a pervasive sadness, haunted by the recent suicide of his close friend Carl Casagemas, which cast a long shadow over his creativity. Matisse, meanwhile, was forging relationships with other painters who felt the pull away from strict realism. By 1904, Matisse was spending time with André Derain and Maurice de Vlaminck, experimenting with brash applications of color that had little to do with faithfully depicting nature. In search of luminous color and the glow of sunlight, Matisse traveled to the south of France to Collioure, where the Mediterranean's bright blues and the harsh midday light taught him how color could function as pure expression. In works like Lux, Calme et Volupté, 1904-5, Matisse used bold, pointillist-inspired dabs of paint that shimmered with an almost artificial radiance. Then came the scandalous 1905 Salon d'Automne, where Matisse's Woman with a Hat was exhibited alongside similarly garish color experiments by Derain and others. The critic Louis Vaucel famously dubbed the group Fauve, wild beasts, for the unruly violence of their color. Matisse would recall that moment with mixed pride and trepidation, saying something akin to, "We were only searching for new ways to express purity in color, but they saw us as savages." Overnight, Matisse found himself at the center of controversy. While the French establishment accused him and his cohorts of barbarism, a small handful of influential collectors, most notably the American expatriates Gertrude and Leo Stein, purchased his paintings and supported the new direction. Fauvism was not a formal movement in the sense of having a manifesto, but it made Matisse's name synonymous with color's emotional liberation. The timelines of Picasso and Matisse, already distinct, began to converge in the circles of Parisian modernism. Gertrude Stein, an early patron of both, hosted weekly salons at her apartment at 27 Rue de Fleurus, and it was there, among the throng of intellectuals and artists, that Picasso and Matisse first became truly aware of each other's gifts. In some ways, they could not have been more different. Picasso was short, compact, intensely energetic, a showman who thrived on the drama of social gatherings. Matisse was taller, more introspective, meticulous with words, and possessed of a certain calm. Yet these surface differences belied a deep artistic affinity. They both recognized the other as a force to be reckoned with, a once-in-a-generation talent. A story circulates, though it's been retold with many variations, of one of the Stein salon evenings. Picasso teased Matisse for using violent, clashing colors, and Matisse retorted by warning Picasso not to drown himself in black outlines and contortions. Gertrude Stein, observing them, allegedly said something along the lines of, "You two are like the North Pole and the South Pole, each sure the other is upside down." After the Blue period, Picasso shifted to his so-called Rose period around 1904-1906, marked by warmer, more playful hues, pinks, reds, and earthy tones that captured circus performers, harlequins, and saltimbanques. The shift was partly fueled by his personal life brightening somewhat. He found a new romantic interest, Fernande Olivier, and the pangs of Casagemas's death began to recede. But it was also driven by a restless search for new modes of expression. He discovered African and oceanic art around this time, frequenting the ethnographic section of the Musée du Trocadéro, and became transfixed by the raw, stylized forms. These non-Western sculptures, masks, and artifacts sparked something radical in Picasso's vision. By 1907, he was working on a painting initially titled Le Bordel d'Avignon, later known as Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. This painting, showing 5 nude female figures in a brothel setting, their faces distorted into mask-like shapes, would become one of the epical works of modern art. In Picasso's own words, though paraphrased by some of his contemporaries, "It was my first exorcism painting, meaning he tried to purge everything he'd learned about classical perspective and beauty to distill a raw, almost violent form of representation. When Matisse first saw Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, he reportedly reacted with alarm, calling it a mockery of the modern movement. Yet part of him must have recognized it as a challenge. This painting defied all conventions, arguably even more so than Matisse's Fauvist experiments, and it pushed the boundaries of painting into a new dimension. In quiet moments, Matisse later admitted that Picasso penetrates into things. I merely kiss them, a reflection on their differing approaches. Picasso was about dissecting forms, while Matisse sought to distill and elevate them in color. Their rivalry blossomed alongside a mutual, if begrudging, admiration. Matisse was lauded in intellectual circles for his bold color harmonies and orchestrations of shape. Le Bonheur de Vivre, 1905-6, was a prime example, a pastoral scene with naked figures dancing and lounging in a landscape of swirling pinks and greens. Picasso had little patience for what he perceived as Matisse's decorative softness. Meanwhile, Matisse initially saw Picasso's new direction, what would soon become Cubism, as too brutal, too intent on fracturing reality into shards. But neither could deny the other's genius. Collectors and critics flocked to see how these two towering figures would reshape modern art. Both men lured younger artists into orbit. Georges Braque would soon become Picasso's collaborator in crystallizing Cubism. André Derain, Maurice de Vlaminck, and others had once been Matisse's fellow Fauve, though Matisse was drifting beyond Fauvism into more refined explorations of color planes. Braque himself had flirted with Fauvism before turning to Cubism. This swirling cross-pollination was typical of the Parisian avant-garde scene, a hotbed of experimentation and personal dramas. Behind the scenes, scandal and rumor enveloped both artists in different ways. Picasso's personal life was famously tumultuous. The shift from Fernande Olivier to new muses like Olga Koklova and later Marie-Thérèse Walter, Dora Maar, Françoise Gillot, and Jacqueline Roch kept the gossip columns busy. His relationships often overlapped or ended in emotional chaos. The blue and rose periods gave way to Cubism, which eventually led to new forays into neoclassicism and surrealism. Picasso's style was never static, and neither was his love life. Whispers circulated about his intense mood swings. Friends and lovers sometimes described him as sweetly affectionate one moment, explosively cruel the next. One anecdote from a later period came from Françoise Gillot, who said Picasso once turned to her and declared, "Women are machines for suffering," a statement that shocked even those who knew him well. The bohemian circles forgave or overlooked much of this, enthralled as they were by his genius. But it left behind a string of emotionally wounded partners and a scandalized public that occasionally struggled to separate the art from the man. Matisse, on the other hand, led a far more stable domestic life, especially after he married Amélie Paré. He was not free of controversy, however. Critics painted him as the arch-fauve, the man who had destroyed color's natural harmony. Some insisted that his works were offensive to the eye. A few critics used scathing words like insanity or aberration. Matisse was sensitive to such attacks, yet he persevered. He once stated, "I have been no more than a medium, as it were." He believed that color was not merely descriptive, it was a means of conveying harmony and emotional resonance. Though less flamboyant in his personal affairs than Picasso, Matisse faced storms of critical disdain and periods of financial precarity, particularly during those early years when the public was slow to warm to his radical palette. As he grew older, he garnered prestigious commissions and staged influential exhibitions, but the memory of those harsh early critiques always lingered. In conversations with friends, Matisse would sometimes recall the 1905 Salon d'Automne fiasco with a quiet chuckle and a hint of nostalgia, calling it the time they set the wolves on me. The two men, by the 1910s, occupied central positions in the art world that was swiftly globalizing. Picasso, working closely with Braque, hammered out the principles of analytical cubism, deconstructing objects, musical instruments, bottles, newspapers, into geometric facets. The radical flattening of space was a direct challenge to centuries of Western perspective. Then came synthetic cubism, when collage elements entered the canvases, further disrupting traditional definitions of fine art. Matisse, though never a cubist, observed this revolution from his own vantage point. He visited Morocco between 1912 and 1913, seeking new light and exotic motifs, translating them into vivid, simplified forms. His interest in Islamic art and the decorative patterns of textiles informed his subsequent work, such as Zora on the Terrace, 1912, and Arab Coffee, 1913. Matisse's forms became increasingly flat, his colors more daring, but he did not fracture reality as Picasso did. Instead, he orchestrated color blocks and outlines in a way that prefigured his later cutouts. World War I, 1914-1918, disrupted the steady flow of innovation in Paris. Many artists left the city or enlisted. Both Matisse and Picasso stayed, but their activities were affected by shortages, by the sense of gloom that pervaded Europe. Picasso, a Spanish national, was not drafted. He continued to paint, occasionally selling works to foreign buyers. Matisse's sons were called up to serve, which caused him deep anxiety. The two masters, rarely close on a personal level, maintained a respectful dialogue. Neither was content to rest on past triumphs, so they continued experimenting. Picasso's post-war period saw a strange pendulum swing. On the one hand, he embraced a new, more classical style in some figurative works. On the other, he delved into surrealist themes in pieces that distorted anatomy in dreamlike ways. One might see in Three Musicians, 1921, the echoes of synthetic cubism, while in his classical Olga in an Armchair, 1918, a more representational approach emerges. Scholars have labeled this a form of parade of styles, typical of Picasso's endless reinventions. Matisse also went through changes. In the early 1920s, a calmer aesthetic entered his work, often referred to as his nice period. He moved to the French Riviera, drawn by the luminous skies and the mild climate. He painted odalisques and interior scenes, with windows opening onto the azure sea. The colors were softer than his Fauvist phase, but still radiantly alive. The essence of the artist is to provide pleasure, Matisse remarked during this period, a sentiment that sometimes caused critics who preferred the edgier Picasso to dismiss Matisse as decorative. Yet behind that veneer of serenity, Matisse was as daring as ever, playing with spatial ambiguity and color relationships. His paintings from Nice often feature patterns upon patterns, striped or flowered textiles, the model's richly patterned robe, and glimpses of exotic foliage through open balconies, leading the viewer into a carefully orchestrated tapestry of color and line. As the 1920s gave way to the 1930s, both men found themselves recognized as living legends, albeit of very different strains. Picasso was the unstoppable chameleon whose global fame was cemented with exhibitions in the US and across Europe. The Surrealist movement, led by André Breton, embraced Picasso as a fellow traveler, even if he never fully pledged allegiance to any ism. Matisse was revered by an international circle of collectors, including Americans like the Coen sisters of Baltimore, who bought his work in bulk. A certain tension still existed between them, nurtured by critics who seemed to enjoy pitting them against each other. Picasso, the champion of form, Matisse, the champion of color, Picasso, the bull in the ring, Matisse, the slow, methodical craftsman. In truth, both men privately admitted to learning from the other. He has all the color, Picasso supposedly said in a casual conversation with an American journalist, but sometimes I think I have him in line. Matisse, for his part, famously stated, "In modern art, we have invented nothing. We do not create, we discover," a nod, perhaps, to Picasso's shape-shifting boldness that forced Matisse to keep discovering new frontiers of his own. The personal spheres of these two luminaries continued to generate scandal. Picasso's marriage to the ballerina Olga Koklova deteriorated in the late 1920 AS. He embarked on a passionate affair with the 17-year-old Marie-Thérèse Walter, who became a muse for some of his most sensuous works. The secrecy of that relationship and the eventual birth of their daughter Maya in 1935 caused tremendous upheaval. Olga left him, though they never formally divorced, due to legal and financial complications. Shortly thereafter, Picasso became involved with the photographer Dora Maar, whose emotional depth and stormy temperament rivaled his own. The swirling chaos of his personal life seemed to feed his creativity, resulting in iconic pieces that teetered between violence and tenderness. Guernica, 1937, perhaps the most famous painting of the 1930 AES, was Picasso's response to the bombing of the Spanish town by fascist forces. Stark, monumental, it depicted screaming horses, anguished women, and a bull's head, all in a monochromatic palette of black, white, and grey. It was displayed at the 1937 World's Fair in Paris, shocking viewers with its raw depiction of suffering. Decades later, Picasso would say, "Painting is not made to decorate apartments, it is an instrument of war." And indeed, Guernica was a powerful statement of protest, instantly becoming one of the most recognized symbols of anti-war sentiment. Matisse's life during the 1930s was less outwardly dramatic. He remained in Nice and surrounding areas, focusing on painting, printmaking, and drawing. He was commissioned to decorate the Barnes Foundation in Marion, Pennsylvania, which led to one of his most ambitious projects, the dance murals he completed for Dr. Albert C. Barnes. This large-scale work further extended Matisse's interest in simplifying form and amplifying color. Yet personally, he underwent difficulties. His marriage to Amélie became strained, and they would separate in 1939. Despite the heartbreak, he poured himself into his art. Around this time, he also underwent surgery for a serious abdominal ailment, an event that weakened him physically but seemed to ignite a new artistic fire. Seated or bedridden for much of his recovery, Matisse explored the possibility of cutting paper shapes and arranging them into compositions. The seeds of his later paper cutouts were thus planted, though it would be another decade before he fully embraced the technique. By the time Europe lurched into the catastrophe of World War II, both Picasso and Matisse were well into middle age, but neither would rest. The occupation of France by Nazi Germany brought a sense of dread to the Parisian art scene. Many artists fled, but Picasso, once again protected by his Spanish citizenship, stayed in Paris. He was harassed by the Gestapo, who disliked his modernist work, particularly Guernica. There are accounts of German officers visiting his studio. One story goes that an officer pointing to a postcard of Guernica asked Picasso, "Did you do this?" Picasso replied, "No, you did." Though the exact veracity of that exchange is debated, it captures the climate of hostility Picasso endured, as well as his brand of pointed wit. Meanwhile, Matisse initially stayed in Nice, which fell under the Vichy regime. His health concerns continued, and his children became involved with the resistance, which worried him immensely. His son Pierre and daughter Marguerite risked their lives distributing clandestine leaflets and aiding the Allied cause. Matisse tried to maintain a quiet profile, immersing himself in painting and drawing while bombs fell and mail was censored. He once wrote to his son, "Despite it all, I work. I do not know if it is a duty or a salvation, perhaps both." As the war came to an end, these two artistic giants found themselves lauded as patriarchs of modern art. Yet neither was content to merely rest on accolades. Picasso, always the provocateur, joined the Communist Party in 1944, much to the astonishment of many who thought him too individualistic for ideology. He created propaganda art, posters, and embraced leftist causes, though some critics accused him of opportunism or naivete about Soviet realities. Meanwhile, Matisse, relieved by the cessation of war, embarked on a final flowering of his creativity: the paper cutouts. His deteriorating health forced him to work from a wheelchair or bed, but with large shears and sheets of painted paper, he found a kind of second youth. "I have needed all that time to reach the stage where I can say what I want to say," he commented. Works like Icarus, 1947, featuring a simple black figure with a red heart against a deep blue background, and the murals for the Chapelle du Rosaire in Vence, completed in 1951, became the crowning achievements of his late career. The chapel itself, a project that began when a former nurse of Matisse's joined a Dominican order, was a labor of spiritual devotion as well as aesthetics. In designing everything from stained glass windows to vestments, Matisse achieved an almost transcendent unity of color and line, something he had been chasing in one form or another his entire life. Picasso's post-war years saw him become an even broader cultural figure, recognized worldwide. He moved to the south of France, near Antibes and later Valaris, setting up studios by the Mediterranean Sea. He explored pottery, sculpture, printmaking, and continued painting in an ever-shifting variety of styles. Critically, some works from his later decades were dismissed as repetitive or whimsical, but Picasso thrived on the freedom to experiment. His face became iconic, featured on magazine covers. He hosted large gatherings, forging friendships with poets and politicians. The man who once lived in a squalid Montmartre attic was now wealthy and internationally celebrated. In public interviews, Picasso might declare, "All I have ever made was made for the present and with the hope that it will always remain in the present," indicating his distrust of tradition and the notion of a final masterpiece. Indeed, he produced thousands of works until his death in 1973, never relinquishing that fierce creative drive. Matisse died nearly 2 decades earlier, in 1954, at the age of 84. Picasso, upon hearing the news, remarked bitterly, "When Matisse died, he left me his odalisques," implying that Matisse's approach to depicting nudes and the sensual lyricism of his color had passed on to him. Yet there was also genuine sadness in Picasso's voice, as though he had lost the only true peer who could match his formidable achievements. Matisse had lived long enough to see his cutouts celebrated in major exhibitions, recognized as the culminating genius of his career. While Matisse was less outspoken about politics than Picasso, he left an extraordinary legacy that transformed the way color could define form. The two men, once pitted as rivals, had become entangled in the public imagination as dual pillars of modernism, each ensuring the other's significance by providing a contrasting lens. In the decades since, scandals have not diminished. Picasso's complex love life and sometimes brutal treatment of his partners came to light through memoirs like Françoise Gillot's Life with Picasso, published in 1964. Lawsuits over authentication and inheritance, especially involving his children Claude and Paloma with Françoise Gillot, underscored the personal turmoil behind the mythic figure. Yet his posthumous exhibitions continued to break attendance records. Matisse's estate was more orderly, but controversies occasionally arose concerning the authenticity of cutouts or issues surrounding the moral rights to the images used in reproductions. Neither man had ever aimed to be purely scandalous in their personal affairs, but as they left behind enormous bodies of work, they also left behind labyrinthine personal stories that enthrall biographers to this day. Beyond their impact on painting and sculpture, Picasso and Matisse shaped broader cultural conversations. Picasso's embrace of the Communist Party during the Cold War turned him into a symbol of leftist intellectualism, appearing at peace conferences and in photographic spreads that showed him wearing the dove insignia. His dove drawings became peace emblems worldwide. This was one area in which his notoriety extended far beyond the confines of galleries or museums. Matisse, quieter about politics, influenced fashion, interior design, and even dance. His bold patterns and interest in decorative motifs caught the eye of textile designers and choreographers looking to emulate the sense of fluidity in his compositions. As the century wore on, the work of both artists increasingly appeared in popular culture. Picasso prints adorned college dorm rooms, Matisse cutouts inspired graphic designers, and references to both showed up in films, literature, and advertisements. Their art also commanded soaring prices at auctions, becoming part of the high-stakes world of art, collecting, and investment. Yet, it is not only wealth or fame that cements their impact. They had changed the visual vocabulary of the modern world. Matisse had demonstrated the radical power of color to define space, an idea that influenced not only countless painters but also modern architects and product designers who discovered that color could be structural. Picasso, with his deconstruction of form, paved the way for abstraction in a variety of fields, from sculpture and painting to the design of everyday objects. Even technology entrepreneurs and futurists would refer to Picasso-like leaps, meaning a willingness to shatter conventions in pursuit of innovation. The same is true in education. Modern art programs across the globe use Picasso and Matisse as primary examples of how to see beyond realism to explore deeper emotional or conceptual truths. Their personal trajectories also serve as parables of artistic dedication. Picasso, the boy genius, found success early but never settled, constantly upending his style, searching for new forms of expression. Matisse, the late bloomer, discovered painting in his 20s almost by accident, yet steadily transformed that discovery into one of the most revolutionary uses of color in art's history. Both overcame social and personal barriers, Picasso navigating poverty and the complexities of the bohemian scene, Matisse defying a conservative father, weathering the condemnation of critics, and later battling ill health. Each, in his own way, exemplified the conviction that an artist's work is never truly finished, that creation is a lifelong dialogue with the world, with tradition, and with the self. If the public once delighted in comparing them as rivals, time has revealed a more nuanced relationship, one of reciprocal influence. While they were never close friends, there was a profound undercurrent of respect. They critiqued one another's work at gatherings, studied each other's exhibitions, and occasionally traded paintings. Beneath any outward show of dismissal, each recognized that in the other's achievements lay the possibility of new directions for painting as a whole. Toward the end of his life, Matisse allegedly told someone that his only true peer had been Picasso. Picasso, well known for not handing out compliments lightly, indicated a similar sentiment when he declared in an interview that Matisse had the sun in his gut, an acknowledgement of the older artist's majestic command of color. In the broader cultural arena, their impact extended into political symbolism, fashion, design, and the shaping of the 20th century's idea of the avant-garde. Picasso's name, in particular, became shorthand for genius and innovation. Time magazine, in a 1957 cover story, called him Picasso the Pro, suggesting that he was both the greatest living artist and perhaps the shrewdest manager of his own legend. Matisse, while also revered, projected a gentler image, particularly in his final years, when he was seen as a kind of sage of color and harmony. The cutouts, with their whimsical shapes and bright hues, were not merely decorative. Artists in subsequent generations, like Ellsworth Kelly and Richard Diebenkorn, openly cited Matisse as a prime influence. Many recognized that he had taken abstraction into new territory by focusing on the essentials of shape and color. Today, their paintings hang in the world's greatest museums: the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Centre Pompidou in Paris, the Hermitage in St. Petersburg, the Tate in London, drawing countless visitors who stand in awe before Les Demoiselles d'Avignon or The Snail, one of Matisse's monumental cutouts. They are part of the cultural consciousness, signifiers of the leap that art took in the early 20th century. The mere mention of Picasso or Matisse conjures images of radical color and form, as well as the rebellious spirit that characterized modern art's break from centuries of tradition. Yet behind the large museum frames, behind the academic analyses and the sky-high auction prices, remain two human stories: one of a Spanish prodigy who devoured influences and continuously reinvented himself in pursuit of an ever-elusive truth of form; the other of a Frenchman who methodically, almost gently, revolutionized color, stepping beyond what critics had called wild beast tendencies to arrive at a tranquil yet daring purity. Their legends were not without personal cost. Picasso's lovers frequently bore the brunt of his mercurial temperament, and he wrestled with the moral complexities of wielding enormous fame. Matisse endured physical suffering, familial separation, and the barbs of critics who deemed his art trivial or merely decorative. Nonetheless, both found in art a path to transcend these hardships. In that sense, they shared a conviction that art was a vital, transformative force. That force echoed far beyond the studio. Both men cultivated relationships with writers, dancers, stage designers, and political activists, injecting their imaginative verve into realms outside of the strictly visual. In the 1910s, Matisse designed costumes and sets for Sergei Diaghilev's Ballets Russes. Picasso, too, joined Diaghilev, designing sets and marrying one of the ballet's dancers, thereby blending painting, theater, and music into a single creative tapestry. Later, when the cinema rose to prominence, directors drew upon their radical sense of composition and storytelling. Even advertising campaigns would occasionally borrow the fractured aesthetic of Cubism or the vibrant palette of Fauvism to catch the public eye. Over the decades, the name Picasso became almost synonymous with modernity, used in popular discourse to describe anything new, shocking, or boundary-pushing. Matisse, if less bandied about in pop culture, remains the revered master of color, his work a kind of reference point for elegance, simplicity, and the joys of light. In sum, these two giants cast long shadows over the century that followed their rise. Though academically they are often studied in distinct categories: Fauvism, Cubism, Expressionism, and so forth, the truth is that they transcended any label. Their real breakthrough was not simply in style, but in a fundamental rethinking of what art could do: show us new ways to see, feel, and interpret our existence. They challenged not just the salon critics of their day, but the entire Western tradition that prized realism and perspective as the summits of art. Matisse's legacy was to say, color is enough to create an atmosphere, to define space, to evoke emotion. Picasso's was to say, form can be broken, reassembled, and made to speak in ways we never thought possible. If at times they provoked scorn or incomprehension, they also paved the way for the liberation of artistic expression across every continent. Long after their deaths, retrospective exhibitions continue to reveal the depth and scope of their achievements. Younger generations still recoil at or rejoice in the audacity of Les Demoiselles d'Avignon or lose themselves in the purity of a Matisse cutout. The fact that these works remain capable of provoking strong reactions is testament to their lasting power. It would be almost impossible to chronicle every award, every controversy, every sale. But in the large picture, what remains is how they carved a path for artists to question boundaries. Their names evoke the notion that creativity is inherently linked to courage, a notion Matisse voiced when he said, "Creativity takes courage." Picasso, in a similar vein, once declared, "Every act of creation is first an act of destruction." These maxims still reverberate, not just on museum walls, but in the ethos of global culture, where innovation often involves breaking something down to build it anew. The parallel trajectories of Picasso and Matisse ultimately remind us that art's greatest breakthroughs seldom come without conflict, personal, public, or aesthetic. But from that conflict emerges a new landscape of possibility. As the years following World War II settled into a new global order, Picasso's and Matisse's reputations had ballooned to almost mythic proportions. Each was aware that his work represented not just a personal achievement, but an entire era's exploration of artistic possibility. For Picasso, this recognition sometimes bordered on a kind of public performance. Visitors who came to see him in his studio on the Côte d'Azur often found a man who thrived on being the center of attention, short, muscular, eyes alight, with that near-predatory sparkle people had noted since his youth. He might pace before a canvas, brush in hand, addressing a gathering of bohemian friends and curious journalists. He was quite willing to show off new sculptures, ceramics, or his latest paintings, which might range from whimsical sketches of goats to intricate expansions of the Cubist idiom. He was still ferociously productive. Even in old age, the sheer volume of his output was astonishing. Matisse, meanwhile, inhabited a quieter sphere, sometimes physically confined by illness, but expansively free in his creative soul. After emerging from his surgeries and medical treatments, he carried on experiments with cutouts, painting sheets of paper with gouache and then cutting bold shapes, arranging and rearranging them until some inherent harmony revealed itself. He once observed to a friend, "Instead of drawing an outline and then filling in the color, I am drawing directly in color." This technique, seemingly so simple, actually demanded a supreme confidence in design. Each cut, each angle had to be sure because a single misplaced snip might destroy the intended balance. His assistants at times would pin the shapes to walls or large boards under Matisse's careful instruction, so he could see how the composition might shift when a piece was moved half an inch. These resulting pieces, the swimming pool, the snail, Zulma, among others, were as revolutionary in their own way as Picasso's radical distortions. They suggested an art that had cast aside the weight of volume and shading, engaging the viewer through a lyrical interplay of silhouettes and luminous color. Looking upon them, one could see how Matisse's entire journey led inexorably to this light-filled, almost childlike, yet deeply sophisticated expression. Meanwhile, Picasso's personal life provided a steady stream of drama. After his tumultuous relationships with Marie-Thérèse Walter and Dora Maar, he became involved with Françoise Gillot, a young painter who brought a new serenity to his household. Gillot was intelligent, independent, and strong enough to stand up to Picasso's mercurial moods. She gave birth to two of his children, Claude and Paloma. Yet despite some years of relative happiness, That relationship, too, founded on the shoals of Picasso's infidelities and domineering nature. Gillot ultimately left him, an almost unthinkable move in the eyes of many who believed no one could walk away from Picasso's gravitational pull. "He loved me more when I was leaving than when I was with him," she later mused in interviews, alluding to the strange dynamic of Picasso's affections. That separation, which took place in the early 1950s, caused a scandal in the Parisian art world, and Picasso never forgave Gillot for publishing her memoir, Life with Picasso, detailing his treatment of women and his working methods. Some critics have read bitterness into certain portraits he made in that period, female figures whose features are scrambled or almost caged behind lines, though Picasso rarely admitted any direct correlation between his personal life and his paintings, preferring to keep layers of ambiguity around his creative process. Matisse's circle of intimates, by contrast, remained smaller and more stable, though his separation from Amélie had caused significant pain. He maintained close ties with his daughter Marguerite and son Pierre, the latter of whom became an influential art dealer in New York, championing modern European artists in the United States. Whenever Matisse communicated by letter with his children, the subject often turned to art. "I am never truly away from my work," he wrote once to Pierre. "Even when I close my eyes, shapes and colors arrange themselves in my mind." That mental arrangement took a particularly spiritual turn when Matisse was asked by Sister Jacques Marie, a Dominican nun who had once nursed him, to assist with the design of a chapel in Vence, near Nice. Matisse initially hesitated. He was not devout in a conventional sense, but the project soon captured his imagination. He set about creating not only stained glass windows, but also designing the murals, altar, vestments, and furniture. The Chapel of the Rosary, consecrated in 1951, stands as one of modern art's most unusual and profound intersections with religious architecture. While some believers questioned the chapel's stark simplicity, the walls are largely white, adorned with Matisse's black outlines of biblical figures, others found it a space of transcendent calm. Matisse himself regarded it as his masterpiece, saying, "This work required all of me. I think I put into it everything that I had." He was already in his 80s, but the fervor of his involvement belied his frailty. Picasso, too, explored more monumental statements. Even as old age approached, he remained as restless and eclectic as ever. During the 1950s and 60s, he devoted considerable energy to ceramics, working at the Madura pottery in Vallauris. He decorated plates, pitchers, and vases with motifs of bulls, doves, faces, sometimes referencing his earlier artistic vocabulary, sometimes inventing new shapes. Critics debated whether these ceramics were a trivial sideline or another fertile domain of his imagination. Over time, the best of them came to be appreciated as an integral part of his oeuvre, further proof that Picasso needed no single medium to express his creative urges. He was also producing large sculptures like She-Goat and Baboon and Young, where found objects melded with plaster or bronze, forging an almost playful sense of metamorphosis. The 1950s were also marked by Picasso's continuing involvement in global peace movements, partly through the Communist Party and partly on his own initiatives. He designed posters for peace conferences featuring his now iconic line drawings of doves. These spare images, reduced to a few flowing lines, became a worldwide emblem of hope in the era of nuclear dread. Yet Picasso's political commitment was complicated. He never set foot in the Soviet Union, though he accepted accolades from its government. His critics argued that he wore his communism lightly, as a fashionable stance. Others maintained that his opposition to fascism and war, so clearly expressed in Guernica, was sincere, even if he disliked dogmatic constraints. Picasso himself shrugged off accusations of political naivete. "Painting is stronger than me. "It makes me do what it wants," he declared, implying that any ideology came second to his artistic calling. Still, there is no doubt that his name resonated far beyond the sphere of aesthetics during the Cold War. He was that rare figure, an artist whose international fame allowed him to serve as a symbol, though often a contentious one, in the ongoing ideological battles of the mid-20th century. For Matisse, the final years of his life were dedicated to refining the cutout technique and overseeing the Vence Chapel. He produced a series of bold compositions, such as the Parakeet and the Mermaid, plastering the walls of his apartment with brilliant shapes that danced across the surface. His weakening body meant he could no longer stand at an easel for long stretches, but his spirit seemed unbowed. Assistants recalled how he could sit or lie in bed, scissors in hand, forging shapes that exuded a surprising dynamism. "I have needed all that time to reach the stage where I can say what I want to say," he remarked to a journalist, pointing to a collage pinned on a wall. The interviewer noted Matisse's eyes brimming with intensity, despite his physical decline. When Matisse passed away on November 3, 1954, tributes poured in from every corner of the art world. He was 84 years old. Although Picasso was not the type to engage in sentimental gestures, the shock that registered among their shared circles made it clear that Picasso felt the loss of his longtime rival and counterpart. In private, he expressed a mixture of wry humor and solemn respect, once remarking to a friend, "Matisse, he left me his odalisques." This statement can be interpreted many ways, but one reading is that Matisse's approach to the sensuous depiction of the human figure remained an unresolved challenge to Picasso's own approach. In subsequent works, Picasso occasionally conjured Matisse-like elements, bright color patches or simplified outlines that some observers read as a belated homage. Matisse's funeral in Nice was modest, in keeping with the character of his final decades. Family members and a circle of close friends accompanied the casket. Though he was not buried at the chapel he created, that building stands as a perpetual monument to a man who saw no contradiction between deep serenity and bold innovation. Picasso himself did not attend the funeral, consistent with his aversion to public displays of mourning. But he evidently painted or sketched with renewed fervor in the days that followed, as though channeling grief into creation. Over the coming years, whenever interviewed about Matisse, Picasso spoke with a slightly sardonic but unguarded admiration. He was known to say, "You should not put Matisse and me in the same basket. He was gentle, I am violent, but we have ties, deep ties." In some sense, the older man's death left Picasso as the unchallenged colossus of modern art, yet that singular status brought its own solitude. Picasso lived nearly 2 more decades, through a series of personal upheavals and ever-shifting styles. In 1961, he married Jacqueline Roch, his last wife, who remained with him until his death. Jacqueline was fiercely protective, acting as a gatekeeper for the endless stream of admirers and petitioners who wanted a moment with the great maestro. Picasso's later paintings became looser, more expressionistic, sometimes revisiting classical subjects like the musketeers and matadors of his youth, but rendered with an almost childish exuberance of color. Some critics dismissed these works as the scrawlings of an aging genius who refused to slow down. Others saw them as a testament to Picasso's unstoppable inventiveness. He also produced a torrent of prints and lithographs, some referencing famous masterpieces from Velázquez, Manet, and Delacroix, Picasso's variations on Las Meninas, Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe, or Women of Algiers, breathed new life into old compositions, fracturing them and reassembling them in the language of Cubism and Surrealism. When a series of these prints was exhibited, a reviewer quipped that Picasso was battling with the ghosts of art history, yet often emerging triumphant. perhaps in echo of his earlier phrase, "Every act of creation is first an act of destruction." He seemed to demolish the canonical works he loved in order to create something startlingly original. By the late 1960 SS, Picasso was widely recognized as the most famous living artist on the planet. He had garnered wealth far beyond anything he might have imagined during his impoverished days at the Bateau Lavoir. His portraits of mistresses, his Cubist guitars, his harlequins, and his political statements on war and peace had all become part of the universal lexicon of modern culture. Yet the controversies and scandals never vanished. Some found him arrogant, exploitative, or insufferably vain. Others believed him to be the last great Renaissance man of art, a person who embraced every medium: painting, sculpture, ceramics, lithography, stage design, and pushed it in new directions. When asked how he viewed his place in history, Picasso allegedly shrugged and said, "I don't think about art when I'm working. I try to think about life." Whether or not that was genuine disinterest in his legacy, the fact remained that museums vied to exhibit his pieces, private collectors paid astronomical sums, and thousands of young artists regarded him with a mixture of awe and rebellion. In many ways, to be a modern artist in the mid-20th century meant grappling with Picasso's colossal precedent, either by adopting aspects of his style or by vehemently rejecting them. Meanwhile, Matisse's presence lived on through his estate and through the growing admiration for his cutouts. Exhibitions in the 1960s and 1970s drew crowds who marveled at the radiant simplicity of the snail or blue nude eye, noting how these works, created by an old man with scissors, felt as fresh and groundbreaking as anything in contemporary abstract painting. Indeed, the abstract expressionists in New York, such as Mark Rothko and Adolf Gottlieb, had often cited Matisse's approach to color fields as a profound influence. Rothko once said that Matisse's Red Studio was the painting he found the most moving in modern art because it showed how color could entirely engulf a viewer in a state of pure feeling. Similarly, many post-war European artists looked to Matisse for lessons in reducing the pictorial plane to essential forms. Thus, even in death, Matisse's gentle revolution continued to ripple through the art world, paralleling Picasso's violent revolution. Picasso died on April 8, 1973, at Mougins in southeastern France, at the age of 91. His final days were spent painting and drawing, as though he refused to relinquish the brush until the last breath. "Drink to me, drink to my health," he reportedly said to friends on the evening before his passing. "You know I can't drink anymore." It was characteristic of his dark humor, a final flourish of bravado. Upon learning of his death, art lovers across the globe went into mourning. In Spain, his birthplace, there were tributes hailing him as a national treasure, though Franco's regime had never been comfortable acknowledging his genius. In Paris, London, and New York, museums organized memorial retrospectives, presenting the staggering breadth of his career. While the shock was not as acute as with Matisse, Picasso was, after all, well into his 90s. His passing felt like the end of a chapter for 20th century art. In the aftermath, battles over Picasso's estate flared up, with multiple heirs and several mistresses laying claim to various portions of his enormous corpus of work. Lawsuits ensued, as well as controversies regarding the authenticity of some sketches and the rights to reproduce his images. For many years, these legal wrangles overshadowed parts of his legacy, though they did little to diminish the public fascination. Matisse's estate had seen its share of disputes, but generally was more orderly, since Matisse had taken steps to structure certain elements of his archive and legacy through his son Pierre's gallery. Furthermore, the cutouts could be more definitively traced, as they were typically large-scale pieces. Picasso, by contrast, had generated such a profusion of paintings, drawings and prints scattered across the globe that the exact count of his total output remains elusive. When scholars assess the long-term impact of Picasso and Matisse, they find that each served as a kind of lodestar. Matisse pointed the way toward the pure joy of color and the harmonious orchestration of shape. His compositions encouraged future generations to see that art could be fundamentally about pleasure, harmony, and the luminous experience of being alive. This is not to say Matisse lacked complexity. His work is subtle and sometimes moody, but his enduring reputation rests on the sense of optimism his images exude, the idea that color itself has the power to uplift. Picasso, conversely, represented the more turbulent forces of innovation, the deconstruction of form, the appropriation and reinvention of motifs from non-Western art, the celebration of the artist as provocateur. In many ways, his work contained more overt references to the tragedies and conflicts of the century, war, violence, inner torment, though it also brims with humor and eroticism. While Matisse's influences can be detected in the color-field painters, many conceptual artists, pop artists, and contemporary sculptors owe a debt to Picasso's example of radical shape manipulation, collage, and the freedom to shift styles at will. In that sense, these two pillars encapsulate the range of possibilities that modernism introduced. They each had their scandals, Matisse with the initial fury over Fauvism, Picasso with his personal entanglements and political stances. They each navigated the tides of critical opinion, sometimes praised, sometimes reviled. Both endured wars that shattered Europe, yet continued to create, affirming that the human spirit can persist in the face of destruction. Both also influenced circles beyond painting. Matisse in dance and design, Picasso in stage settings, sculpture, political cartoons, and more. Their works have become cultural signifiers, referred to in everything from children's books to Hollywood films, from academic treatises to protest banners. Over a century after Matisse's Woman with a Hat caused an uproar at the Salon d'Automne, and well over a century since Picasso stood at his easel as a teenage prodigy, we still see their fingerprints all over visual culture. Students who study art history often find themselves gravitating toward one or the other, Team Picasso or Team Matisse. This informal divide is not so different from the dynamic that played out in their lifetimes, when critics loved to contrast the two masters as if they were boxers in a ring. Yet both artists would likely dismiss the notion that one must choose sides. Each drew upon the other's breakthroughs. Each in his own way changed the fundamental grammar of art. Their personal interactions might have been guarded or tinged with rivalry, but that rivalry fed their respective achievements, spurring them to go further than they might have gone in isolation. One imagines the young Matisse challenging himself to use color in a way that would answer Picasso's fracturing of form, or Picasso studying Matisse's rhythmic lines to find a new impetus for his own inventions. There is a famous anecdote, some say it's apocryphal, of Matisse visiting Picasso's studio late one night, silently inspecting a new Cubist work, and then remarking, "Is that the best you can do?" The next morning, Picasso allegedly tore the painting off the easel and began again, determined to surpass whatever standard Matisse had implicitly set. Even if half mythical, such stories illustrate the creative tension that fueled them. Moreover, both Picasso and Matisse possessed a gift for capturing the public imagination. Picasso, with his swagger and flamboyance, became the archetype of the modern artist as a star, a persona that Andy Warhol and others would later adopt in their own ways. Matisse, more dignified and gentle, appealed to those who saw art as a restorative oasis, a place to find equilibrium in a chaotic world. Their quotes, too, have become part of the common parlance of creativity. Picasso's line, Every child is an artist. The problem is how to remain an artist once we grow up circulates widely among educators and innovators. Matisse's assertion, creativity takes courage, adorns countless motivational posters. In a way, these pithy sayings reflect the deeper philosophies they both embraced. Picasso believed in staying close to the primal sources of imagination, unburdened by convention, while Matisse advocated for the bravery it takes to see beauty and to distill it into something essential. Even outside the realm of fine art, their legacies echo. Fashion designers have cited Matisse's cutouts and Fauvist paintings as inspiration for bold color palettes. Picasso's fragmented forms have influenced graphic designers, animators, and even interior decorators looking for an edgy, modernist flair. Museums dedicated to each artist, the Musée Matisse in Nice, the Musée Picasso in Paris, among others, draw visitors from around the globe, educating new generations about their journeys. Traveling exhibitions that pair their works side by side often become blockbuster events, with lines snaking around city blocks as viewers hunger to see the creative dialogue in person. It would be an oversimplification to say that Picasso broke all the rules while Matisse refined them. Both men broke rules and both refined them in different ways. A more accurate portrayal might be that Matisse freed color from subservience to form, granting it an emotional resonance and structural power rarely seen before. Picasso dismantled form itself, rebuilding it into new, multi-perspectival shapes that reflected the dissonances and energies of the modern age. This synergy, color liberated, form deconstructed, remade the visual language of the 20th century. It also carried forward into fields such as architecture and industrial design, where the interplay of simplified forms and bold tones became synonymous with modernity. Even the notion of how we represent the human face or body changed due to their examples. The idea that one angle or perspective is never enough, that the subject's essence might be better expressed by combining multiple viewpoints or through a sudden burst of blue or red that conveys emotion more directly than literal rendering. When people today refer to a Picasso moment, they often mean a flash of disruptive insight, seeing the world in a brand new configuration. When they mention a Matisse-like use of color, they typically mean a luminous beauty that floods the senses with joy. Such references testify to how deeply these artists have permeated collective consciousness. Neither man worked to become a household name in the sense of pop celebrities, but by pushing the boundaries of art, they inadvertently crossed into popular culture. Their personal stories, replete with romance, rivalry, war, scandal, and triumph, have also played a part in captivating the public. Biographies, documentaries, and novels have seized upon their bohemian escapades and the swirling drama of Montmartre, or the sun-drenched studios of the Riviera. One might ask, then, how these two lives, so different in temperament, upbringing, and approach, culminated in a shared immortality. Part of the answer lies in the era itself. They were born into a period of upheaval when the old certainties of the 19th century were giving way to new technologies, new philosophies, and new social orders. Photography was revolutionizing the role of painting, Freud's theories were unlocking the unconscious mind, and industrialization was altering the rhythms of daily life. Both Picasso and Matisse saw that painting could no longer simply serve as a window onto the world as it was. It had to become an active site of transformation, a way to reflect the fragmented, accelerated, or dreamlike qualities of modernity. They seized that challenge wholeheartedly, never retreating into academic tradition, always pushing forward. Yet it was not merely a matter of capturing the zeitgeist. Each had a personal vision that resonated far beyond the shifting tides of style. Matisse's quest for harmony and lyricism, even in the face of personal pain and a war-torn world, stands as a testament to the enduring human desire for beauty. Picasso's restless shape-shifting, both in art and in life, echoes humanity's urge for continuous discovery, for discarding the old to unearth the new. Together, they embody the tension between continuity and rupture, decoration and destruction, serenity and upheaval, all the polarities that define the modern condition. At this point, decades after both have passed, the controversies about their personal lives remain part of their narrative. Picasso, in particular, has come under renewed scrutiny in the 21st century for his alleged misogyny and the emotional damage he inflicted on many of his partners. Some museums grapple with how to present his work in a context that does not ignore these ethical dilemmas. Matisse's personal record appears comparatively tranquil, though the political and social complexities of his era are also re-examined by contemporary historians. Ultimately, the art historical community must balance admiration for their groundbreaking achievements with a nuanced understanding of the flawed humanity behind them. For some viewers, the knowledge of an artist's personal failings clouds the experience of their art. For others, the art stands apart from the biography, a beacon of creativity distinct from moral judgment. The debate is ongoing and perhaps unresolvable, reflecting the broader cultural conversation about the relationship between an artist's life and work. What remains certain is that the art created by Picasso and Matisse continues to beckon us into new ways of seeing. Their breakthroughs are woven into how we teach art, how we conceptualize design, and how we interpret creativity's role in society. They are cornerstones of museum collections, frequent highlights in exhibitions, and they attract audiences that may otherwise have only a passing interest in painting. Tour guides recount the stories of Picasso's bohemian escapades or Matisse's Fauvist rebellion, bringing a sense of adventure to visitors who may be encountering modern art for the first time. In that sense, both men still serve as charismatic ambassadors, introducing broader publics to the power and mystery of artistic innovation. Yet perhaps the greatest tribute to Matisse and Picasso is the generation after generation of artists who cite them as catalysts. Painters as disparate as Willem de Kooning, Helen Frankenthaler, David Hockney, and Romar Bearden have spoken of how encountering a Picasso or Matisse painting shifted their entire conception of what art could be. De Kooning famously noted Picasso's ability to combine multiple viewpoints in a single figure, while Hockney's series of swimming pool paintings reveals a Matisse-like delight in pattern and luminous color. Bearden's collages echo both the Fauvist color vibrations and the Cubist fragmentation of space. Younger talents, from graffiti artists to digital creators, still riff on the visual languages these two giants pioneered, mixing and matching references in an endless recombination reminiscent of Picasso's own collages or Matisse's cut-paper shapes. In the end, the story of Picasso and Matisse is not just a double biography, but a grand narrative of 20th century creativity, two colossal figures who observed, tested, and redefined the possibilities of art. Their parallel arcs, one marked by perpetual reinvention, the other by a distillation toward luminous essence, comprise the twin poles around which much of modern painting revolved. Their tales encompass personal scandal, artistic daring, political involvement, wartime resilience, commercial success, and late-life blossoming. They each found ways to remain vital creators well into old age, thereby challenging the notion that art belongs only to the young. As Matisse once murmured, "I do not literally paint that table, but the emotion it produces upon me." Picasso might have paraphrased that in his own fiery style. "I don't paint what I see, I paint what I think." Between those two statements lies a vast field of experimentation that shaped how subsequent generations approached the very act of looking. Whether one feels drawn to Matisse's tranquil color orgies or to Picasso's jagged collisions of perspective, there is no denying the transformative legacy they share. Their work invites us to question how we perceive the world, to find new ways of rendering emotion, and to accept that beauty can be born from radical upheaval as well as from quiet devotion to line and hue. Though their mortal journeys ended, the conversation they initiated in paint, pencil, charcoal, cut paper, collage, sculpture, and beyond continues as vibrant and challenging today as it was when they first astonished the salon-goers of Paris with canvases that shattered the old mold. Picasso the Spaniard, Matisse the Frenchman, two iconoclasts who marched to different drummers, but who each, in his own right, helped to define the beat of the modern age.